For centuries, we have been told that humanity carefully preserved the knowledge of the past. Libraries, archives, and universities are presented as guardians of civilization's memory. Yet a closer look at history reveals a troubling pattern: an extraordinary number of fires, revolutions, and accidents between the 17th and 19th centuries that destroyed vast collections of older books and manuscripts. Many of these texts dated from before 1800 and vanished during a remarkably narrow window of time. Was this simply the result of poor fire safety and chaotic political upheaval, or something more deliberate? Some researchers argue the losses were random. Others believe the pattern raises uncomfortable questions about who controls history. A statistical anomaly revealed: you have been sold a comforting illusion about the past. The assumption of deep history tells us that our modern libraries are unbroken time machines, perfectly preserving the ancient world for us to study today. We are taught to believe that as humanity stepped out of the medieval period and into the modern era, we became master preservers of knowledge. We assume that the transition into modern governance and scientific discovery was accompanied by a careful, meticulous archiving of the primary sources that came before us. But a close look at the actual timeline of human memory reveals a fractured, deeply severed lineage. The era between 1650 and 1850 is universally celebrated as the Enlightenment, a triumph of reason and science. Yet beneath this celebrated narrative lies a catastrophic window of destruction. This 200-year span did not just see the occasional unfortunate loss of old books. It witnessed an intense, highly concentrated liquidation of the original documents that formed the foundation of Western civilization. Are we really supposed to believe that this relentless chronological barrage of statistical anomalies is merely a byproduct of bad luck and faulty chimneys? Consider the Great Fire of London in 1666, which completely erased the irreplaceable medieval ecclesiastical and municipal records housed in St. Paul's Cathedral. Just 5 years later, a major conflagration at the Escorial Monastery in Spain wiped out over 2,000 unique Arabic and Greek manuscripts. The devastation continued in 1728 when a massive city fire consumed the Copenhagen University Library, taking with it the ancient Norse sagas and the foundational texts of Icelandic history. Only 3 years after that, the Cotton Library fire of 1731 burned through unique Anglo-Saxon manuscripts that can never be recovered. These are not isolated tragedies. They are a systematic clearing of the board. Take the deeply suspicious 1764 winter fire at Harvard Hall. At the exact time the provincial legislature was using the building, a fire broke out, destroying 5,000 volumes. This catastrophic event permanently erased early American maps, rare classical works, and the entire personal library of John Harvard himself. The pattern of destruction followed the newly formed United States government to its highest levels. The Library of Congress, the very bedrock of American administrative memory, burned not once, but twice. The War of 1812 saw the destruction of early legislative records in 1814. Then, as if the first loss was not enough, an accidental fire in 1851 conveniently consumed 35,000 volumes. This specific blaze effectively erased 2/3 of Thomas Jefferson's personal library, wiping out the precious accumulations of more than 30 years just as the young nation was formalizing its historical identity. When you look at these events in aggregate, the official explanations of wartime collateral damage, or simple accidents, begin to sound incredibly hollow. The modern historical establishment maintains a strange silence regarding this undeniable pattern. Historians generally accept this massive erasure of human knowledge as an unremarkable consequence of pre-modern fire safety, completely failing to investigate why these specific fires targeted the exact documents necessary to verify the continuity of ancient and medieval claims. This silence acts as the ultimate cover-up for what was truly happening. The original texts that might have challenged the newly established historical chronologies and scientific paradigms of the Enlightenment were systematically destroyed. What we are left with is not an unbroken chain to our ancestors, but a hard reset of the archival base of Western civilization. The timeline was severed, and the history we know today was rebuilt from the ashes of the texts they chose to spare. By accepting this loss as mere coincidence, we surrender our ability to question the foundations of our modern world. We must ask who benefits from a past that can no longer speak. Intentional state-sponsored book erasure. We must move beyond the idea of mere suspicious accidents and confront a far more disturbing reality about our past. The destruction of the historical record was not always the result of a stray spark or a careless candle in a wooden building. In many crucial cases, it was a deliberate and calculated matter of aggressive state policy. We are looking directly at an era of intentional, state-sponsored bibliocide, where the systematic eradication of physical documents was utilized as a blunt tool for political consolidation. To truly understand this ruthless mechanism, we have to plunge into the absolute chaos of the French Revolution. Following the nationalization of church goods in 1790 and the aggressive decrees of 1794 and 1796, the revolution became much more than a bloody upheaval of the ruling aristocracy. Revolutionary officials and highly organized mobs engaged in a specifically targeted campaign, systematically emptying the massive libraries of ancient monasteries, soaring cathedrals, and sprawling aristocratic estates. An astonishing estimated 4 million volumes were liquidated during this terrifying period of cultural reset. The revolutionary mobs did not just burn random books in a blind, unthinking rage. They specifically hunted down ancient title deeds, provincial charters, deep family genealogies, and complex feudal registers. By incinerating these very specific legal documents, the newly forming state was actively liquidating the entire legal and social framework of the preceding centuries. The rising, centralized modern state knew it could never fully cement its absolute authority if the legal evidence of the old world still existed on paper, proving prior land ownership and established social hierarchies. This calculated strategy of historical erasure was not isolated to the borders of France alone. We see a chillingly similar catastrophic reset occur during the 1812 burning of Moscow amid Napoleon's disastrous winter retreat. The massive inferno that consumed 5/6 of the city buildings also managed to completely obliterate the entirety of the vast Kremlin archives. These secure vaults housed the official foundational paperwork of the Russian state, dating all the way back to the 14th century, along with absolutely irreplaceable 16th century copies of formative cultural and literary works like the Lay of Igor's campaign. The sudden loss of these vital state records and irreplaceable metric books meant that the deep history of the Russian people had to be almost entirely reconstructed from scratch. The majestic past was hastily rebuilt from whatever fragmented summaries and secondary copies happened to be preserved by the few loyalist institutions that miraculously survived the massive historical reset. To fully grasp the true magnitude of this cultural loss, we have to deeply contrast this newly centralized, state-controlled historical narrative with the way human memory was intimately preserved before the widespread fires began. Prior to this great consolidation of power, the preservation of personal and community history was wonderfully decentralized. Ordinary families proudly served as independent citizen archivists. They meticulously passed down beloved heirloom books, primarily foundational primers, family Bibles, and worn prayer books, which functioned as highly portable, incredibly personal repositories of vital genealogical data. Inside the sturdy covers of these treasured books, families documented their own births, marriages, and deaths across countless generations. This extremely widespread practice established a truly vast, decentralized social universe of Scripture that completely defied overarching state and ecclesiastical control. The history of the common people was securely kept by the common people. Yet, precisely during that fateful window between 1750 and 1850, this ancient, unbroken generational chain was forcibly shattered. As these vulnerable domestic archives were either lost in the rampant city fires or actively confiscated by authorities, authentic family memory was entirely absorbed and subsumed into the highly sanitized, tightly controlled collections of massive public and academic repositories. The newly centralized modern state successfully and permanently became the absolute sole authorized guardian over the entirety of the vast human past. The flawed science of authentication. Let us dismantle the very science of historical dating. Since the vast majority of original, unrestored manuscripts from before the year 1800 were systematically incinerated or liquidated, we are forced to confront a massive structural flaw in our timeline. This structural flaw is known as the authentication paradox. We must determine how anyone can definitively verify the reality of the ancient world when the primary evidence is missing. Instead of genuine originals, almost everything we possess from the ancient and medieval periods consists of later copies, reproductions, and standardized translations published during or after the 19th century consolidation. This absence of original source material forces modern researchers to rely entirely on internal analytical methods to date and authenticate documents. You might assume the bedrock of historical dating is foolproof and scientifically absolute. In reality, the entire system is built upon a foundation of circular reasoning. The primary method used is paleography, the study of ancient handwriting. This discipline was formalized in 1681 by a scholar named Jean Mabillon in his defining work De Re Diplomatica. He developed this system specifically to defend the authenticity of monastic documents against rising skepticism. Yet the method he established frequently relies on comparing unverified post-fire documents against other post-fire documents of equally uncertain origin. Scholars are essentially using copies of unknown provenance to authenticate other copies of unknown provenance. They assume models of linear simplicity in human handwriting, rather than acknowledging the chaotic complexity of actual scribal practices. Modern science is often heralded as the ultimate savior for historical verification, but a closer look at the actual testing limitations shatters that illusion completely. Radiocarbon dating, specifically measuring the decay of carbon-14, is widely treated as the gold standard for determining age. This perception is flawed. Radiocarbon dating only measures the age of the organic substrate, meaning the animal parchment or the plant-based papyrus itself. It absolutely cannot date the age of the ink applied to the page, nor can it determine the actual composition date of the text. Someone could easily take a blank piece of 1,000-year-old parchment and write a brand new text on it today, and the radiocarbon test would still tell you the document is 1,000 years old. Ink analysis is equally limited and practically useless for deep historical verification. This method requires measuring chemical shifts in ink technology over time, but there are far too few verified anchor documents left from antiquity to create a reliable baseline. The massive loss of original texts means we lack the control samples necessary to make ink analysis scientifically viable. The absolute most glaring implications of this paradox are visible in the study of our most revered biblical manuscripts. The Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus are universally considered the foundational 4th century witnesses to the biblical text. Their timelines remain suspicious. The Codex Sinaiticus was miraculously discovered in a remote monastery only in the 19th century. The Codex Vaticanus was strictly hidden away and restricted from scholarly view until the late 1800s. These are the two most important documents for establishing the ancient roots of the modern Bible, and yet their chains of custody conveniently vanish into thin air right during the exact 1750 to 1850 windows of destruction. The absolute pillars of our ancient historical and religious timelines only appeared after the Great Reset was complete. The systematic curation of knowledge. With the old world systematically burned away, a profound dilemma emerges regarding who exactly gets to write the narrative of the new one. As the thick smoke finally cleared from the widespread archival destruction across Europe and the Americas, surviving ancient knowledge was rapidly consolidated into a few massive state-controlled institutions. We are taught from a very young age to view grand places like the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Library of Congress as purely neutral protectors of human heritage. In stark reality, these towering institutions operated not as passive repositories merely holding old books, but as highly aggressive curators of the specific Enlightenment narrative. They were entirely staffed by loyal state-appointed scholars who wielded absolute authority over which fragmented remnants of the deep past would be reprinted and standardized, and which alternative voices would be permanently marginalized from public consciousness. The philosophical foundation for this vast intellectual filtration system was heavily championed by influential Enlightenment figures like the Taoists, scholar Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He actively conceived of national bibliographical organizations fundamentally designed to function as a universal library, dedicated exclusively to the centralized state. This was absolutely not a system built for open scholarly access or the free, unhindered exchange of complex ancient ideas among ordinary inquisitive citizens. Instead, it was an explicit administrative mechanism, specifically designed from the ground up to heavily promote what the newly emerging centralized state deemed completely acceptable and useful knowledge for the general population. The absolute central goal was to tightly curate historical information to strictly align with very specific sovereign state interests, while simultaneously and intentionally suppressing any ancient literature officially classified by these new authorities as inherently unholy or fanatical in nature. This systemic intellectual filtration guaranteed that only historical information perfectly aligning with the brand new paradigm of linear human progress would ever survive to reach the printing presses of the modern era. When we carefully analyze the specific surviving texts, a highly targeted pattern of deliberate disappearance becomes absolutely undeniable to any serious observer. The priceless ancient documents that vanished with the most alarming frequency were certainly not random victims of natural decay or unfortunate wartime accidents. First, ancient alchemical and hermetic treatises detailing incredibly complex alternative spiritual paradigms were aggressively labeled as dangerous heretical works and permanently removed from widespread public circulation. Second, highly advanced technical manuals that could actually explain the seemingly impossible engineering behind massive ancient megastructures largely vanished from the public record. This deliberate state erasure left massive, unexplainable gaps in our historical understanding of exactly how our ancient ancestors truly built their colossal stone monuments across the globe. Third, anomalous geographical maps and astronomical charts that directly threatened the newly standardized linear timeline of human progress were quickly relegated to heavily restricted special collections or simply liquidated outright by state agents. The grand history we meticulously learn today is ultimately a heavily filtered survival narrative designed by the absolute victors. We are essentially studying a highly sanitized and tightly managed version of the past, deliberately crafted to legitimize the overarching power and unquestioned authority of the modern state apparatus across all of society. It remains nearly impossible for any independent scholar or civilian researcher to properly question the official historical story, because the physical evidence desperately needed to successfully challenge those deeply ingrained assumptions is no longer legally available for public review. The authorized state-appointed librarians and zealous revolutionary officials did not merely organize the incredibly chaotic archives of collective human memory into wonderfully neat little orderly rows for future academic exploration. Instead, they systematically turned the incredibly dangerous opposing physical evidence into fine ash, cementing a wholly manufactured reality for every single generation that followed them indefinitely into the endlessly expanding and completely unknown horizon of our fundamentally engineered future. We must absolutely recognize this massive and entirely intentional intellectual crime today. Elite vaults of hoarded history. Here is where the narrative takes a profoundly darker turn. While the collective memory of the general public was being systematically reduced to ash during the great fires and violent liquidations, a very different reality existed for the ruling class. The ancestral private libraries of certain old money dynastic families and incredibly powerful banking bloodlines somehow remained miraculously untouched by the devastation sweeping across the public sphere. These vast private collections represent the ultimate historical plot twist. We are forced to confront the existence of a meticulously engineered, two-tiered system of historical preservation. The terrifying truth is that the unbroken chains of custody connecting us to the ancient world were never actually lost. They were simply privatized. The original unrestored primary sources that mysteriously vanished from the public record are sitting quietly in highly secured private vaults today. To understand how this hoarding operates, we must examine the extreme gatekeeping practiced by these elite repositories. The Rockefeller Archive Center presents itself as a major repository for the study of modern philanthropy, but the reality of accessing its historical contents tells a vastly different story. The facility operates under incredibly strict protocols, heavily managed by a highly discretionary access team that determines exactly who is deemed worthy to view the internal records of global governance. You cannot simply walk in and verify the past. This strict control is mirrored and even amplified at the Rothschild Archive in London. Access to these sprawling banking history files is granted strictly at the discretion of the family itself. More alarmingly, all family papers generated after 1945 are entirely sealed off from independent researchers, while highly sensitive historical documents, like the World War II-era Moscow, papers are kept strictly under lock and key. These institutions effectively act as private historical fortresses, ensuring that the foundational documents of modern financial and political power remain completely insulated from public scrutiny. We can see the stark contrast of this hidden reality when we examine a rare exception that managed to slip through the cracks of the Great Consolidation. The collection gathered by Manly P. Hall, which is now preserved in the Rittman Library, offers a breathtaking glimpse into exactly what was deliberately purged from the great national libraries. This specific archive miraculously holds 47 original alchemical manuscripts and complex hermetic treatises dating precisely from 1500 to 1825. These ancient texts are filled with intricate symbolic illustrations, advanced laboratory diagrams, and profound spiritual teachings. This is the exact forbidden knowledge that was aggressively hunted down and permanently exiled from the standardized public narrative during the 18th and 19th centuries. The undeniable survival of this specific collection proves that alternative scientific and spiritual paradigms existed and thrived right up until they were intentionally erased by state curators. This leaves us with a stark and deeply unsettling realization about the nature of the reality we inhabit. The unbroken chains of historical custody absolutely do exist today, but they are deliberately hoarded by a tiny elite. A massive wall has been erected between the public and their own human heritage. The masses are fed a steady diet of fragmented copies, standardized translations, and carefully, heavily curated summaries. Meanwhile, the ruling dynasties keep the authentic originals securely hidden away behind heavily guarded doors. This massive hoarding ensures that ordinary citizens can never truly verify the official state-sanctioned narrative because the absolutely crucial primary historical sources truly required to successfully challenge that heavily protected and false narrative are kept completely locked away indefinitely from any outside independent human observer forever. The engineered silence of history. We must finally confront the two-headed beast of historical consolidation that completely dictates our modern understanding of the past. The overarching mechanism of strict control is entirely absolute and unforgiving. First, we suffered the deliberate, physical erasure of original texts during that highly suspicious 200-year window of destruction. Millions of irreplaceable primary sources were permanently turned to ash to clear the board for a new centralized narrative. Second, State-funded universities immediately established the deeply flawed authentication paradox, demanding we blindly trust institutions to verify a past they themselves heavily curated. Because the original evidence needed to challenge this modern narrative no longer exists in the public sphere, we are forced to rely entirely on blind faith. The strange and persistent silence of mainstream historians regarding this undeniable pattern of systematic library fires is not an innocent oversight. It is the ultimate defense mechanism of the modern state, designed to protect the fragile illusion of linear human progress. The missing primary sources of the pre-1800 worlds are not merely a tragic accident of history. They represent the absolute, highly intentional, and meticulously engineered silence upon exactly which our entire modern reality was ultimately securely built.